Many people think that medieval peasants lived, worked and died in exactly the same place. Well, that's not actually true. They travelled a surprisingly large amount, and for all sorts of different reasons. Let me explain. Of course, most ordinary people did spend the majority of their lives in the same village. After all, 95% of the population were farmers, looked after their own land. If they were villeins, they worked the land for the Lord. If they were free, they worked their own land. Now, technically, if you weren't free, you needed permission from the Lord of the Manor to travel. But it seems like that was probably sought and given quite easily. It wasn't really that formally done. You could travel, especially to the local market, and sometimes quite a lot further afield. Now, if you were poor, didn't have a horse, didn't have a beast of burden, there's a fair chance that your travel was going to be on foot. And some people travelled from England all the way to the Holy Land, mostly on foot, a journey that would have taken months, if not years. Of course, roads in the medieval period were of very variable quality, as you might guess. There were Roman roads. The Romans, quite a few hundred years ago, had built about 2,000 miles of highway, incredibly high quality highway across England and some of Britain as well. And a lot of those were still in use. Some of those were looked after and maintained. Some of them were in really bad condition, and others are completely abandoned because nobody used them anymore, because they're not going anywhere that anybody wanted to go. So it's quite variable. Most medieval roads, though, were more like footpaths or bridleways, or what we call easements today. You had the right to travel along that road, that route, rather than it having a surface like we would imagine a pavement might be. So the surface itself was probably going to be, well, it was going to reflect the weather that you were travelling in. So if it was really rainy, it was going to be very muddy. And there are medieval rules that you were allowed to go off the main path if it was impassable, if there was an obstacle, if there was a vast lake of mud and you couldn't actually get through it. You were actually allowed to go all the way round on somebody else's land, including actually damaging their crops by way of circumventing the obstacle. And that was permitted by law. It's probably frowned upon by the farmer, but it was actually permitted by law. So travel was quite important, and enabling travel was very important for the medieval period. Now, how did you actually find your way? Because there weren't GPS systems like there are today. And today, let's face it, lots of people type in their destination and they just follow the GPS. The GPS tells them where to go, even when they're walking, but certainly when they're in the car. How do you get from village to Canterbury, let's say? Well, there are things called itineraries, which are basically lists of places you need to go in order. So what you would do is go from your village to the local town. You would know that route. You'd get to the town and then you'd say, which is the road to the next place I need to get to? And you take that road, and then you get to that place and you'd ask the locals, which is the road to place on your itinerary? And you'd follow that road. So you're sort of leapfrogging from location to location, possibly not even having an idea of the physical layout that we would from sort of satellite photos or modern maps. But it was actually a very efficient way of travelling because you used local knowledge to find out where you were getting to. And eventually you would take the Canterbury Road to get to Canterbury. Or, as they used to say, all roads finally lead to Rome. So you'd go along these highways and you'd eventually get to Rome if you wanted to, and then beyond. Even today, some of the roads are labelled with the destination they're going to. So for example, in Oxford, there is a road called London Road, which goes to London, and that same road becomes Oxford Street when you get to London. So if you get to London and you want to go to Oxford, you take exactly the same road, but from the perspective of London. So an awful lot of roads in England are still named after the destination. So it makes it quite straightforward. Now, how did you know you were on the right road? Well, sometimes there were road markers, there were crosses, there are markers on the ground telling you a certain distance to a certain place. Few and far between, but they were there, especially on the major roads. And there were places that it was expected you would stop. So medieval people, unlike fantasy adventurers, typically didn't really go and camp in the woods on their journeys. They typically went from A to B, stayed in a tavern or an inn, in a kind of way station. And so places that you went to were organised around travel. It was expected that you would stop in this place. And there were different values. You could have a very posh room if you wanted to, with clean sheets, or you could be sleeping basically in the tap room in the tavern, or in the stables in fact, or even in somebody's barn. It was expected that these sort of places were allowable for you to sleep in. Of course, when you travel in the medieval period, you're going to be meeting a whole cast of different fellow travellers. Obviously, pilgrims, people going to market, you've got mercenaries, you've got messengers, you've got people travelling for pleasure, just exploring. You'd have monks, you'd have people travelling on the business of religious houses, you'd meet soldiers as well, all sorts. You probably wouldn't actually be that vulnerable to being attacked though, because the roads in medieval England were, it appears, surprisingly safe. There obviously were criminals abroad, but not as many as you might think from television and Hollywood movies. They were actually relatively safe. I couldn't find many records of ordinary travellers being that worried about being attacked. Although people did tend to travel in groups, so maybe they weren't as safe as we might think. Possibly carrying knives and decent sticks meant that you were a bit more safe than might be today. Of course, people travel long distances on foot today. There are still pilgrimages done. Santiago de Compostela is still done by a lot of people, and there are pilgrim routes all the way along there. But you probably are not going to walk more than 15 miles a day. So going to Constantinople or beyond to Jerusalem, 20 miles a day, 10 miles a day, that was a lot of days walking. But it appears it was done often, at least once in a lifetime in the medieval peasantry. It was on a peasant's bucket list, if you like. It was something they had to do. And if Chaucer's tales are anything to go by, they weren't as devout as some people might have thought. You kind of were supposed to be being religious, but it was the journey that mattered. You were going to be surrounded by the company of other travellers, possibly people you'd met before, possibly complete strangers who became friends. You will be travelling a long way in a big group of people, and you would get to know them. You would be drinking with them, you would be having fun with them, you'd be getting cross and angry with them as well. And the Canterbury Tales are all about the different characters that went on pilgrimages. I think there's a fair chance that most of them weren't that pious. They were going on pilgrimage more as a holiday thing. They were probably pious when they got there, and turning up to a medieval cathedral when you'd only lived in the local village and the biggest house was the Lord of the Manor's modest manor house. If you went to see a medieval cathedral, it would have been spectacular. It would have taken your breath away. They still take your breath away today, even when we have high-rise buildings that are taller. There's something majestic about the medieval cathedral. And so even the ones that weren't pious, I think, probably had a bit of a rush of religious fervour. And of course, there were souvenirs as well. So you got to that cathedral, you wanted to prove that you'd been on pilgrimage. So, like today, you bought those souvenirs, tin badges, all sorts of things like that, possibly even relics. Because you could buy cheap relics. You could buy a piece of cloth that had been looked on by some saint. Probably wasn't, it's probably fake, but you know, it gave you a keepsake to take back with you and show to all the friends in the village that you'd been there. I love that idea, that the journey was the main thing. Yes, you were going to a destination, but you were also having the experience of travel. And remember, if you're travelling on foot, you're going very slowly, so you would see the world revealed to you. You would almost smell the changes. You would see the landscape change from one place to the other. And certainly if you were going on a major journey, you would actually see the plant life change. The language people spoke would change as well. And eventually you would get to a totally different climate. You might have gone from English, slightly rainy green fields all the way through Spain or all the way through Italy, eventually to the Holy Land and the deserts there and the very much hotter landscapes. So I think medieval journeys would have been as much about personal discovery as they were about getting somewhere as quickly as possible.